think we all know what type of resources Australia has been using to make their country so rich, but maybe it's time now to change and use what other things are on your doorstep.
This country doesn't make sense. It has pristine nature, horrific wildfires, and is one of the richest countries with some of the best renewable resources in the world.
We don't say hello, we say g'day, because here, every day is a good day.
But despite having an easier job stopping climate change than most, and way more reason to do so, Australians are among the world's worst polluters. Their historical emissions are higher than the citizens of all but 2 countries. They're lobbying worse than most, and their ambitions weaker. So how did Australia become a climate villain? And can it clean up its act?
Whether or not you believe in climate change and the effect that humans and what we're doing, how much it's causing to affect that doesn't matter. That really doesn't matter. Surely we can all agree that renewable sources such as solar, wind and tidal is better than burning things out of the ground and letting it go into the atmosphere. I don't know how there can be any arguments with that. I really, really don't understand how there could be any arguments with that. So it is mad to think that Australia does have amazing tidal, amazing solar potential, amazing wind potential. They could even chuck a little bit of nuclear in there if they really wanted. But Australia is continuing, like it says, with the lobbying. Oh my God, it's almost like America with their gun lobbying. That is how bad I think it is. And, the outcome, you can see the bushfires, all those poor animals, suffering from the fires and all the flooding. We've talked about this on the channel, the extremes that Australia goes through. Let's explore the video a little bit more.
Now let's be clear from the start. Australia isn't alone in its love for fossil fuels.
No.
In 2023, Germany tore down a whole village so a company could dig up coal. And yeah, countries like the US and China have their own big problems too. But 3 things make Australia particularly weird. The first is that it's hit so much harder by climate change than most of the rich world. It's home to the Great Barrier Reef, which hotter seas are set to wipe out this century.
Some will say the reefs are fine, some say they're not. I'm not even getting into that argument.
And it's suffered horrific wildfires and floods one after another. The second reason is that Australia should be an easy country to turn green. The country of just 26 million people is the 13th biggest economy in the world. It has some of the world's most skilled engineers and tradespeople. And it has loads of sun, wind and water to power itself cleanly. The third strange thing is that Australia's climate efforts haven't kept pace with other rich countries.
Australia has said it aims to cut its carbon emissions to net zero by 2050.
That announcement only came in 2021, after pressure from allies like the UK and US, and it wasn't backed up by an actual plan.
I would like to hope that, the previous government with ScoMo, they're the type of people to be negative. They're the type of people, like the Conservatives over here, that won't actually do the actions. And I really want the new government, old Albo, to really prove that he is different from the other party. I really, really do. It's just like when Labour get into government, because my God, they better get into government in the next election. You desperately want Keir Starmer and Labour to actually show, no, they are different. They're not just going to carry along like the Tories.
To understand Australia's climate policy, you have to understand its economy, which was built on mining its resources and shipping them to East Asia and the US. First, the government stole swathes of land from indigenous Australians and claimed rights to the minerals buried underneath. Then it leased the land to companies and charged them to dig up the resources. That tied the country's wealth to its mines early on. A big part of that was coal. Just 2 decades ago, Australia made 80% of its electricity from coal. Today, that share is still around 50%.
It's getting there.
That's twice
slowly.
as much as the US burns and 25 times more than the UK. But the fuel it burns at home isn't the only problem. Australia also exports more coal than any country except Indonesia. And all that shows in its politics.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared.
That was former Prime Minister Scott Morrison in 2017. This is Tony Abbott, another former Prime Minister, 3 years earlier.
Coal is good for humanity.
For the last...
Sorry, did I just hear that right? Did I just hear that right? Coal is good for humanity. Oh, God. Wow, that's the first time I've heard that, and that is a ridiculously stupid point to try and make.
Last decade, a coalition of conservative parties pushed coal-friendly policies and pushed back on basic climate science. They were kicked out in 2022, giving Australia a chance to finally clean up its act.
Please.
Now, things have certainly changed, but the ambitions of the new centre-left government also fall short, and we'll come back to exactly how later in the video. But it was the actions of the old lot that gave Australia the reputation as a climate villain.
When we turn up to international meetings, we always get the wooden spoon. We're always called out as a laggard.
This is Kate Crowley. She studied Australia's climate policy over the last decades.
Our policy positions, if you read between the lines, they're always, well, we'll do anything but actually cut emissions. We'll do anything but actually reduce the amount of coal we're exporting. We'll do anything but make a proper transition.
Do you know, I can understand why there is hesitancy, because at the end of the day, the coal that is exported is what has made Australia quite a lot of money. And so if you're not exporting the coal, you're not making the same amount of money. But it's then using the different resources. You've got the lithium, and I don't care what anyone says. You can tell me in the comments, oh, it's just as bad. Oh, you've got to use coal to dig it out. Shut up. Because it's a hell of a lot. It's hell of a lot better than digging out the coal and then transporting it, burning it, etc., etc. So I'm not having any of that. It's just rubbish. Listen to the bloody scientists. But I appreciate that. But you've got to use the different sources. If you can stop spending money on burning fossil fuels and instead, have free electricity that you can charge for, you're still making that profit. Yeah, I understand why it's difficult to transition for people that rely on that money, but the finances are there to use other resources.
The most obvious reason for Australia's slow progress is its coal, oil and gas industries, and the power its lobbyists wield over politicians and media. One business lobby group reportedly had the audacity to call itself the Greenhouse Mafia as early as the 1990s because of the influence it wielded on politics. A former speechwriter to an environment minister documented how the group sat on environment committees where they dictated Australian climate policy for decades. When governments tried to price carbon and tax the profits of mining companies, business leaders applied pressure to politicians. And at the same time, they swayed public opinion with interesting marketing schemes.
If the price of coal goes up,
then there was a revolving door between the energy industry and politics. A study from the Grattan Institute think tank found there was substantial movement between ministerial officers and lobbying roles in the energy and resources sectors. It found that more than 1/3 of all lobbyists were former government officials. And, to make matters worse, Australia has some of the weakest political finance laws among rich countries. In the last election, unidentified political donors gave the big parties more than 90 million Australian dollars. Now, this money comes from donors with all sorts of interests. But what's outrageous is that Australians have no idea which industries are buying influence.
It's very difficult to disentangle that level of influence. You'd have to do something about strengthening political lobbying laws and political donation laws for a start.
Now, all parties need money. Even in the UK, all parties, you've got to appreciate, need money for the campaigning and everything like that. And that's fine. But what I would say is it's selecting carefully who you choose to accept money from. At the end of the day, people that are giving money want to have an influence. That's just the way of life. That is what it how it works. But as a party, they said you've got to be selecting very carefully the right people that you want to be having influence. Like in America, really, is it a good idea to have the old gun maniacs giving influence via money? I'm not sure.
Now, for a country burned so badly by extreme weather, it seems strange that people haven't demanded these governments stand up to the fossil fuel industry.
Yeah.
But there is a good reason for this. A partisan media with one side downplaying climate change.
First, have a look at this fear-mongering from the Climate Council.
Are you sure Australia's emissions really could make a difference?
This doesn't mean we deny climate change or we deny that some action shouldn't be taken, but it does. This study does disprove the idea that we're living in a catastrophe already.
A surprisingly large chunk of Australian media is in the hands of one powerful man.
Mr. Murdoch.
The three biggest newspapers are owned by Rupert Murdoch, the 91-year-old media mogul behind Fox News in the US. His company News Corp Australia also owns a TV channel, Sky News Australia. They pushed the industry's agenda so hard they even went after conservative politicians who were moderate on climate change.
The campaign on climate denial is just staggering.
That was former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, who was ousted by his own party after trying to limit greenhouse gas emissions. Murdoch's papers have historically sowed doubt about scientific facts and attacked policies that could cut pollution.
The funny thing is as well, even people that don't believe in climate change and are basically conspiracy theorists, right? They all know Murdoch is an absolute nutter that controls all the media pretty much. And yet they will still go in line with it. And you may be watching this. You may be one of my subscribers that is watching this that doesn't believe in climate change and sort of is one of these conspiracy theorists. And I just hope that some of these things will, and it won't, I know it won't, but I would just like some of these things that, facts from scientists, I believe scientists over media for starters. I just wish it would make some impact. Some impact, please.
One study found 45% of its articles about climate change between April 2019 and March 2020 were skeptical of the science or rejected it. And their coverage of policies to stop global warming was twice as likely to be negative than positive. Things have started to change, at least a bit. In 2020, Rupert Murdoch's youngest son James called out his father's media empire for climate denial as bushfires ravaged Australia. And then he quit. A year later...
So his son basically said his dad needs to stop this climate change denial, and he quit. That is a massive, massive sign. However, I didn't know about it. Maybe if more people knew about it, it would have had a bigger impact. So that's a shame, real shame.
The company surprised everyone with a campaign to highlight the benefits of cutting emissions.
News Corp papers unveiled a bold new editorial position this morning with a 16-page wraparound urging action on climate change.
So the company is moving away from open climate denial, but is still pushing to delay action. One argument that has worked particularly well is the idea that fighting climate change will cost Australian jobs. Australia is home to some of the world's biggest mining companies. The industry makes up about 10% of the country's GDP, and politicians, journalists, and business executives shout about this loudly.
The proposed scheme is already threatening future contracts, putting the jobs of 500 staff at risk.
I'm sorry, I have to straight away just cut in because it really wouldn't cut jobs, because jobs would be created in different sectors, for example. For example, if you're not digging for coal, well, things like batteries and whatnot, they need lithium. Well, that is, you can simply replace those jobs with those jobs and it is the same role. The infrastructure needs to be built and the manufacturing will be there. There will be a whole new industry. It's not about, this is the thing, when you get this when you say about rising in technology, jobs will be lost. No, technically, jobs won't be lost. They will just be changed. They'll be moved to a different sector and whatnot. So these sort of comments are not even remotely true. And we've seen this throughout the year, throughout history, when technology improves, the same comments always happen and always end up false.
Without capital, there's no projects. Without projects, there's no jobs. So
they're not about to trade off their jobs any more than we are.
Finding new jobs for fossil fuel workers is important. But the role that coal, oil and gas play is way smaller than Australians think.
This perception that fossil fuels are really crucial to the Australian economy in terms of jobs is fundamental in sort of the narrative against climate action, but really, like, it doesn't really stack up in practical terms.
This is climate analyst Sumitri Venkatasubramanian. She found Australians overestimate the size of gas and oil industry employment by a factor of 58. It's a similar story for coal. People think coal mining makes up 13% of GDP. It's actually 10 times less.
Wow.
The weird thing here is that not only does Australia have enough sun and wind to make loads of renewable energy, it also has huge deposits of minerals that are key to cleaning up economies, like copper and lithium. And despite all the denial, Australians are pretty supportive of stopping climate change, which, given the fires and floods and droughts that they're living through, maybe isn't so surprising.
This is what I've noticed. Now, obviously, in the comments of previous videos of similar situations, like the oil fields up in the west coast, there have been silly comments, right, of saying, "Oh, we need fossil fuel," all this. But it has been pleasant to hear so many saying, "Oh, I'm embarrassed by the government. I'm embarrassed by by Western Australia and whatnot, and embarrassed basically by." What the government is allowing to happen, and there is no progression. That's what it's about, progressing, getting with the technology and moving forwards as a not just as a country, but as a world. So there are definitely plenty of people in my comments that are for change. They see these things that are happening.
The Australian Institute study found 75% of Australians are concerned about climate change. 79% want to phase out coal plants.
Those are some pretty large figures that show the opinions of Australians that maybe doesn't stack up so much with this idea that Australians on the whole are climate deniers.
That mindset played a big role in the last election. The ruling Conservative coalition lost votes in wealthy areas of big cities to the Teals, a network of independent candidates who promised more climate action.
What is going on?
That helped the traditional centre-left party win the election. The new government has set a target to cut emissions 43% by 2030 from their 2005 levels.
Right, I've got to say this, just looking at the previous government and whatnot. Surely people can see that people are untrustworthy just by the way they look. A lot of Conservatives over here, for example, look like they are from the Conservative Party, and they look untrustworthy. Who the hell would think Boris Johnson was trustworthy? Who would think, by looking at Rishi Sunak, that he is trustworthy? There just seems to be a common theme that the kind of the right-wing sort of, for people that don't want to be progressive, they look the same. They look like that type of person that doesn't fill me with trust and hope.
Now, these targets are still too weak to stop the planet heating 1.5 degrees Celsius, the level world leaders said they tried to aim for, but it would get it down to about 2 degrees. But despite its higher ambition, the new government has two big problems. The first is the number of fossil fuel projects it plans to build.
Australia has 117 new fossil fuel projects in the pipeline. And so if those get approved, if those go through, that's going to blow all of our emissions, over any limit that we set.
But the bigger problem is the reliance on carbon offsets to clean up the economy. The government wants to make industry emit less CO2 for each good it produces. The limit will shrink about 5% each year. But instead of forcing companies to pollute less, the government's letting some of them buy certificates that say they've avoided pollution elsewhere.
We've learned
a lot of
about
the time
this.
By planting trees or protecting forests.
And the honest government ads.
The problem, though, is that the market for these certificates is badly regulated and full of junk offsets that don't actually cut emissions. You can learn more about the problems in this video here. And Australia's plans are just far weaker than the EU's rules, which don't allow forest offsets in its emissions trading system and limit the total number that can be used.
There's no requirement that they can't start new projects. They can keep polluting, they can keep expanding, they can keep increasing their emissions. As long as they buy offsets, that's totally fine.
Still, Australia is cleaning up its energy system. Cheap renewable energy is displacing fossil fuels, even where policy is weak. And even where the federal government has been slow, some states have moved fast. Queensland and Victoria are getting out of coal. Tasmania's electricity grid is already 100% renewable, and it wants to generate double its need from clean energy by 2040. Australia's reputation as a climate villain makes sense. It's fought policies to clean up the economy, lobbyists and journalists have kept it hooked on fossil fuels, but its people want change, and that's something that's starting to show.
Well, it was an interesting video, and I like that it's as a basis. What I think actually, and I think this is going to be the situation around the world. It is going to be the people that makes the difference. Yes, one person does nothing. It does nothing, right? Me getting solar panels and an electric car does absolutely nothing to the grand scheme of things. However, the governments are not doing enough. They are not doing enough. So it is, if everyone does their part, then things are changing. The difference is people are becoming more self-reliant. People are getting solar panels on their roof. And if everyone is getting solar panels on their roof, then there is a huge decreased need in coal and gas, to power their houses. And heat pumps you can get as well, which is, you can supply yourself. And therefore, if there's no need for this new supply of coal and gas, well, they're not going to keep digging it up. So eventually, I think it's going to be about the people rather than the governments, unless the governments really want to get off their asses. And it's not just Australia. The United Kingdom needs to do a hell of a lot more. America needs to do a lot. China, we all know. Actually, the funny thing is, China's a funny one because they promise little, but they normally outdo their promise. Whereas other places, they promise a lot, but don't achieve that. So I don't think you can blame China for everything on this one. They are slowly getting better, just like others. An interesting one. Please feel free to leave your comments down below and your thoughts. If you are someone that thinks climate change, it's not real, things are fine, we don't need to get off using coal, then do yourself a favour and don't leave a comment. No, actually do leave a comment, because all comments are good comments, even if they're horrible. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure you like and subscribe. If you want to support the channel, you can become a member, you can buy me a coffee, you can buy merchandise, and also go to charlieandrob.com. I'll catch you next time.